this last session on HR, Mike Dobert is joining us again. And Mike, what I want you to talk to us a little bit about here is the whole issue of compliance. One of the things that business owners get a little nervous about is labor laws and making sure we're within the guidelines. And I know it varies with different size companies. I know it varies from state to state. In fact, we probably have many people who are watching from outside the United States, where we're based.
Sure.
We're here in the state of Texas in the U.S. Talk to us a little bit about compliance issues and the kinds of things that business owners need to be thinking about or need to be aware of.
That's a great question, Glenn. Thank you. I think one of the first things is the question of an employee handbook. And sometimes there's suggestion, well, don't have an employee handbook because then you got to follow it. Well, it all comes down to, number one, how you write it. And so one of the first things I like to share with a client, and I draft a lot of these handbooks, is be thoughtful on your language. Be thoughtful about binding language. And what I mean by that is where you say you will have a job description or you will have an annual review. Well, that's our intention. But sometimes there's administrative errors, something happens, or something's in development. So using language such as it's our intention to versus you will. So that's very meaningful, particularly if there's some sort of legal consideration that everybody's operating in good faith. But if there's an administrative issue, then you're not locked in. The other thing you mentioned that was very wise is considering two things. Number one, in general, and particularly in the U.S., and this applies to outside the U.S. too, know your laws. And if you don't know the laws, simply reach out and seek advice. And obviously there's resources for everybody to look at, from counsel to HR consultants or what have you. In the consideration of the United States, one thing I always ask a client is, are you at less than 15 employees? Are you at 15 or more, or 50 or more? Those two thresholds, 15 and 50 employees. At 15 in the United States, your equal employment opportunity laws come into play. If you have less than 15 employees, you're not a covered entity. Now, it is important to be fair and equitable in the spirit of those laws with any employee, even if you have two. But if you write a handbook and you have 10 employees and you say we're an equal employment opportunity employer, you may have unintentionally subscribed to laws and coverage that you otherwise wouldn't have.
I see.
And again, you want to treat people right. The spirit of the laws are there, so I encourage everybody to follow that spirit. But be thoughtful, because if you put that in there and someone comes after you with a claim and goes to the OC, if you're under, you can say, well, I'm sorry, we want to look into it.
You could actually hurt yourself by how you're worded, and that's why I think it's valuable to have someone like yourself or a professional review that handbook so the wording is proper.
Well said. The 50 is the Family Medical Leave Act in the United States. Now, the other thing, the differences between the states, at least in the United States, generally come down to overtime laws and then benefit leave laws. And so a lot of states have more generous leave laws, more generous overtime considerations. And obviously in the international market, there's a different set of laws to consider. So knowing your laws. The other thing I'll share on the area of compliance that's very, very important is what I would kind of sum up as wage and hour practices. And so that comes down to the classification. One of the biggest areas of compliance right now within the United States is the misclassification of an employee as an independent contractor. I talked to a client the other day. The person says, well, I just want to be a 1099 independent contractor. With great respect to that person, they don't get to choose that. There's certain criteria that qualify them as either an independent contractor or an employee. The next consideration under the Fair Labor Standards Act, the federal laws, are they exempt or non-exempt? So that kind of is like the hourly salary, but not exactly like that. I like to back off from that. Most employees are non-exempt, which means I pay minimum wage at the federal level or the state level, and then I observe the overtime laws. Exempt are the fewer, such as a manager who gets paid a certain salary. It's locked in or set for the week, but there's no consideration of overtime. So being very, very thoughtful and understand beyond the federal level state laws that, particularly states like California, each city sometimes has a certain minimum wage consideration.
Wow.
So being thoughtful in your wage and hour area and the classifications. The other area, Glenn, is documentation. And I'm actually going to speak tomorrow. A lot of clients and in the corporate world have said, Mike, and this kind of goes back to the HR perfect world, the real world.
Yes.
But Mike, if employment's at will, why do I have to have documentation? Well, employment isn't at will unless you otherwise have entered into a contractual agreement. And sometimes you do that with key people. But having that documentation is going to do a couple of things. Even though it's at will, if first and foremost, if someone files unemployment, you're going to need to be able to demonstrate, if you're showing misconduct that they were fired, that they were actually warned. There was maybe a final incident. And I understand sometimes an organization may have to make a quick, or not a quick, a very thoughtful but decisive situation or judgment call on the fact that someone needs to go. They're just not successful. So you may not have the best documentation. You may not be able to defend an unemployment claim. That's not necessarily the biggest thing. But if you want to protect your unemployment tax rate, you certainly want to make sure you have good documentation. It's word versus word. We hold the burden of proof. The other thing is, beyond that, if someone were to claim you were unfair in your employment practices, which really comes down to your EOC laws, that you were non-discriminatory, there was a justified reason, it wasn't an illegal reason, or you were doing something wrong, the documentation is going to show, no, I didn't let them go because of an illegal reason. I let them go because of a bona fide failure to meet performance standards or follow policies or what have you. So an employer is almost guilty until proven innocent, with great respect to the law, that you have the burden of proof. The other thing, too, I mentioned in there, beyond documentation itself, it does help, is wrongful termination. And when I think of wrongful termination separate from fair employment practices, I'm thinking of a situation where I say, I let that person go because they stole. Well, did you see them steal yourself, or do you do an investigation based on witnesses and stuff? You have reason to believe they've stole. So we're saying it two different ways. If I say you stole, then I need to back that up as a fact.
You've got to prove it.
And defamation, those things. If I say I have reason to believe in good faith, so I think that's really ties into. And so the documentation actually helps support that you had reason to believe. I did a validated, investigation, for example.
Yeah.
But those are some of the things, having the handbook written the right way, referencing the right laws, really making sure, above other things, and I-9 compliance, all those are very important, doing your harassment discrimination training. But I think the wage and hour piece is pretty clear cut. They're exempt, non-exempt, independent contractor or not. And then also making sure to have the right documentation to protect and show that you are acting in good faith.
Well, this whole program, this training program, is about learning how to scale and grow your business. And most every business that grows needs employees, or they need people who help produce the work. And so I hope you will take these videos, these training sessions on human capital, or HR as we refer to it, and really build a solid, strong HR system in your business. And keep these things in mind that Mike shared with us, so that you always operate within the proper boundaries of the law, but you also protect yourself as an employer.